No one expected her name to come up. Not in this courtroom. Not in this case. And certainly not in the way it did, because this trial was supposed to be about press intrusion, about phone hacking, about old newspaper stories, and whether they crossed a legal line years ago. It was meant to be technical, procedural, dry even. Instead, within hours it detonated into something far more intimate and far more uncomfortable. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And the reason was not a document. It was not a journalist. It was not even the defendant. It was a woman who had stayed silent for more than a decade. Chelsy Davy. Her name landed in court like a dropped glass. Not loud at first, just sharp enough to make everyone look up. And once it did, the case stopped being what everyone thought it was. Here's the unsettling part. Chelsy didn't appear as a witness driven by grievance. She wasn't there to relitigate a past relationship. She wasn't chasing relevance. In fact, everything about her public life suggests the opposite. She left the royal orbit quietly, built a career, avoided interviews, refused the narrative, which is why this moment mattered. Because when someone who has spent years not speaking suddenly does, it raises a different kind of question. Not why now? Not even what did she say? But what made it unavoidable? And why did it surface here, in a courtroom where the stakes were already high for Prince Harry? This was his case. His fight. His attempt to draw a hard line between himself and the British press. He has said repeatedly that this trial is about accountability, about stopping what he describes as unlawful information gathering that damaged his life and his relationships. That framing matters, because relationships are central to this story. Even if the court was never meant to hear about them in this way, what no one anticipated was that one of those relationships would step out of the shadows, not to accuse the press, but to describe something far more personal. Something that doesn't fit neatly into legal arguments or press statements, a moment of doubt, a message, a timing that refuses to be ignored. According to what emerged in court, Chelsy Davy told the court that Prince Harry contacted her just months before his wedding, not casually, not ceremonially, but with words that suggested hesitation, reflection, a longing for something unresolved. For the life we almost had, that phrase alone changes the temperature of the room, because this wasn't years before. It wasn't during a messy breakup. It wasn't in the chaotic early days of royal dating. It was close enough to the wedding to matter, close enough to raise questions no one is comfortable answering. And before we go any further, it's important to slow down, because this isn't about sensationalizing private regret. It's about understanding why this detail, now public, carries such weight in this particular moment. Why does a private message, allegedly sent years ago, suddenly become relevant in a legal battle over press conduct? Why does it appear now, when the case has already drawn international attention? And perhaps most uncomfortably, why did it seem to hit Harry himself so hard? Because reports from inside the courtroom suggest that the atmosphere changed. Subtly at first, then visibly. Harry is not new to courtrooms. He's not unfamiliar with pressure. But this wasn't pressure from opposing counsel or hostile questioning. This was something else. Something internal. Something that appeared to catch him off guard. And that's where this story stops being a straight legal narrative. Because when emotion enters a courtroom, it doesn't just color testimony. It reshapes perception. The public came to this case expecting one story. A prince versus the press. What they encountered instead was something messier. A collision between public certainty and private uncertainty. Between the story Harry has told about his past and the version that emerged from someone who had no incentive to rewrite it. And looming over all of this, unspoken but unmistakable, Meghan Markle. She is not on the witness list. She is not present in court. She has made no statement about this testimony. And yet her presence is felt in every implication of it. Because this alleged contact didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during the early stages of Harry's relationship with Meghan, a relationship that would soon be framed as absolute, transformative, and destiny-driven. That's the contradiction the court didn't ask for, but received anyway. How do you reconcile public declarations of certainty with private admissions of doubt? How do you square a love story presented as inevitable with a message that suggests hesitation? And perhaps most difficult of all, Does acknowledging doubt undermine the truth of what came after, or simply make it human? These are not legal questions, but they are narrative ones. And narratives matter, especially when someone has spent years carefully constructing one. As the testimony unfolded, it became clear that this was no longer just about whether journalists crossed a line. It was about whether Harry himself had been fully honest with the public, with the court, and possibly with himself. And then came the moment that changed everything. Because according to accounts from the courtroom, Harry reacted, not explosively at first, but noticeably. A shift in tone, a tightening, an impatience that hadn't been there before. At one point, that tension reportedly drew the attention of Princess Anne, a senior royal figure known not for dramatics but for discipline and restraint. Her response, brief and stern, was said to reset the room. That alone should tell you something. When a case about newspaper conduct prompts an intervention from one of the most no-nonsense members of the royal family, it signals that the trial has drifted into dangerous territory. Not legally, emotionally. And that's where we need to pause. Because what we're witnessing isn't just a court case spiraling into personal history. It's a reckoning with timing, truth, and consequence. With what happens when unresolved moments resurface in the worst possible place, under oath, under scrutiny, and in full public view. Chelsy Davy did not come to court to rewrite history, but by speaking at all she may have complicated it beyond repair. And, the most unsettling question, remains unanswered. If this message had never surfaced, if this doubt had remained private, would this trial look the same? Or did one moment of honesty, years ago, quietly set the stage for everything that followed? Well, because if this is what came out in the introduction, what happens when the court starts digging deeper into the past Harry thought he had already explained? And more importantly, what happens when timing itself becomes the most damaging evidence of all? What if the relationship didn't end when everyone thinks it did? That's the uncomfortable question hovering now. Not romantically, not nostalgically, but structurally. Because to understand why a message sent years later carried so much force, you have to understand what never fully settled in the first place. Harry and Chelsy didn't end in flames. They ended in exhaustion. That matters. There was no single betrayal that closed the door. No dramatic moment that allowed both sides to say cleanly, "This is over." What there was instead was pressure. Relentless, grinding pressure. Cameras where they shouldn't be. Stories written before facts were confirmed. A life that demanded public performance from someone who never wanted it. Chelsy didn't just walk away from Harry. She walked away from a system. And Harry knew that. He's acknowledged it himself, in different ways over the years, that the attention was corrosive, that the intrusion changed how he behaved, how he trusted, how he chose. But what often gets lost in those admissions is the asymmetry of it all. Harry was born into the machinery. Chelsy was dating it. There's a difference between being trapped and opting in. At the time the narrative was simple. She couldn't handle royal life. That story stuck because it was convenient. It framed the breakup as inevitable. Clean. No loose ends. But inevitability is often something we assign after the fact, once we're tired of asking harder questions. Because if it were inevitable, there wouldn't have been so many pauses. So many almosts. People close to that period describe a relationship that didn't fracture so much as fray. On again, off again rhythms, reconciliations that felt tentative, conversations that circled the same problem without resolving it. And through it all, Harry stayed caught between two instincts that rarely coexist peacefully. Loyalty to his role, and resentment toward it. That tension didn't disappear when Chelsy left. It simply lost its outlet. What replaced it eventually was certainty, or at least the appearance of it. When Meghan entered the picture, the story changed tone entirely. Suddenly, there was clarity, purpose, urgency. The language shifted from hesitation to destiny, from "this is hard" to "this is right." That contrast is important, not because it invalidates the later relationship, but because it reframes the earlier one. It suggests that what Harry may have been searching for wasn't just love. It was alignment, someone willing to face the machine head-on with him. Chelsy never wanted that fight. And here's where the narrative becomes more complicated. Walking away doesn't always mean letting go. For Chelsy, leaving the royal orbit appears to have been decisive. She rebuilt her life deliberately, away from commentary, away from speculation. She didn't trade on proximity. She didn't correct the record. She simply moved on. Harry, on the other hand, stayed inside the story. And the story kept rewriting him. There's a tendency, especially in hindsight, to treat former relationships as stepping stones, as lessons learned on the way to something better. But that framing assumes closure. It assumes understanding. And what if that understanding never fully arrived? The message that later surfaced, the one Chelsy preserved, didn't read like an attempt to reopen old wounds for drama's sake. According to accounts, it read like something else entirely. Like someone checking the door one last time. Not to walk through it necessarily, but to see if it was truly locked. That's not romantic. It's human. And it's also destabilizing. Because it raises a question that sits uncomfortably beneath the official timelines. Did Harry ever fully reconcile the life he was choosing with the one he was leaving behind? Or did he simply move forward faster than his doubts could keep up? It's easy to dismiss this as overanalysis, as reading too much into a moment of vulnerability, but context matters. Especially when that vulnerability surfaces in a courtroom years later, stripped of its original privacy. This wasn't a drunken text. It wasn't a casual, "How are you?" It was, by all indications, reflective, intentional, and, crucially, it was saved. Chelsy didn't respond publicly then. She didn't weaponize it later. She didn't leak it. She held on to it quietly, as people sometimes do with moments they don't yet understand the significance of, until significance finds them. And that's where the court comes back into focus. Because when Chelsy was asked about her past relationship, she didn't expand. She didn't editorialize. She didn't offer emotional commentary. She described what happened. When it happened. And what was said. That restraint is what made it land. The courtroom wasn't reacting to gossip. It was reacting to timing, to the implication that while one narrative was being prepared for public consumption, another was still being privately negotiated. Ask yourself this. If you were weeks away from a life-altering decision, one that would define you publicly forever, would you reach backward unless something inside you was unresolved? And if you did, would you expect that moment to follow you into court years later? Oh, this is where the emotional contrast sharpens. Harry has framed much of his legal battle as a response to damage done to his relationships by the press, and there's truth in that. But what happens when a former partner suggests that some fractures predated the headlines? That uncertainty existed even before the glare intensified. That doesn't absolve the media. It complicates the narrative. And complications are dangerous in legal settings built on clarity. Because now the court isn't just weighing whether journalists crossed a line. It's watching a man confront a version of himself that doesn't align neatly with the story he's told or perhaps believed about his own past. The discomfort isn't accusatory, it's existential. And it showed. Observers noted subtle shifts in posture, shortened answers, a defensiveness that hadn't been present earlier. None of it dramatic enough to headline on its own, but together suggestive, as if the past had stopped being theoretical, as if a door Harry thought was closed had just been proven otherwise. And that's the danger of unfinished stories. They don't stay buried. They wait. The question now isn't whether Harry loved Chelsy or whether he loves Meghan. Those are too simple. Too binary. The real question is whether doubt, once expressed, can ever be fully erased, or whether it simply goes quiet, until the moment it's least welcome. Because if this is what emerges when the court looks backward, carefully, reluctantly, what else might still be sitting in the gaps between the public milestones? And when the trial turns next to the exact timing of those messages, line by line, moment by moment, will the past remain contextual? Or will it become central? Why does timing matter more than words? That's the question the courtroom never asked out loud, but everyone seemed to be thinking once the date attached to that message became clear. Because content can be debated, intent can be argued, memory can be contested, but timing is stubborn. It doesn't bend easily to interpretation. And this timing sat uncomfortably close to a line no one wanted to look at too closely. Months before the wedding. Not years, not during a lull, not after a breakup spiral. Months, close enough that plans were already in motion, close enough that the future had been publicly named, close enough that doubt, if it existed, carried weight. This is where the narrative tightens. Up to this point, it was possible to treat Chelsy's testimony as contextual background, a former relationship providing color to Harry's broader claim that press intrusion damaged his personal life. But the moment the timeline narrowed, that framing stopped working, because now the court wasn't just hearing about a relationship that ended badly. It was hearing about one that resurfaced at a precise and consequential moment. And precision changes everything. Think about what that period looked like publicly. Engagement announced. Media frenzy accelerating. Language hardening into certainty. Interviews framed around destiny, protection, and decisive choice. The story had momentum. It was moving in one direction only. Privately, according to what emerged in court, something else was happening. A message was sent. Not impulsive, not careless, reflective enough to be remembered verbatim years later. Reflective enough to be preserved. That detail alone raises a quiet but powerful contradiction. Oh, if the relationship with Meghan was already framed internally as settled, why reach out at all? And if the contact was harmless, why did it linger? In memory, in record, in consequence. It's tempting to minimize this as a moment of cold feet. As pre-wedding nerves magnified by the scale of the event. That explanation is comforting because it's familiar. It allows doubt to be normalized without being interrogated. Oh, but the language matters. What was described in court wasn't simply anxiety. It wasn't fear of commitment. It was longing. A backward glance. A reference to an alternate life. One that had been consciously set aside. And that's different. Longing implies comparison. Comparison implies choice. And choice implies consequence. Well, this is where the case quietly begins to slip out of its legal frame and into something more psychological. Because what the court is now indirectly examining isn't just the impact of media intrusion, but the internal state of the person claiming harm. Harry has argued that press attention destroyed his relationships, that scrutiny poisoned intimacy, that it made normal emotional development impossible. Those claims are not unreasonable, but Chelsy's testimony introduced a complication. What if some of the uncertainty predated the pressure? What if the instability wasn't only external? That doesn't negate Harry's experience, but it reframes it, and reframing is dangerous when credibility is at stake. The defense, of course, didn't need to say any of this explicitly. They didn't have to attack Harry's character or intentions. All they had to do was let the timing speak, because timing doesn't accuse. It suggests, it invites the audience, and the court, to draw their own conclusions. Ask yourself this: if you were about to marry, truly convinced, fully aligned, would you articulate regret about a past life in writing? Or would that regret already have been resolved? The answer isn't universal, but the question is unavoidable. What made this even more charged was the restraint with which Chelsy presented it. There was no embellishment, no emotional framing. She didn't speculate about Harry's motives. She didn't interpret his state of mind. She simply anchored the message in time. And time did the rest. Observers noted a shift almost immediately after this point was introduced. The energy in the room changed. The rhythm of questioning slowed. Harry's responses, once fluid, became tighter, shorter, more controlled. Control, in moments like this, often signals strain. But this wasn't a hostile cross-examination. It wasn't a trap, a lure. It was a mirror. And mirrors are harder to argue with. Because once doubt is placed on the record, not as rumor, not as interpretation, but as something contemporaneous, it can't be unseen. It sits there, demanding context. Harry's legal team faced a delicate balance. Push back too hard, and the moment gains importance. Ignore it, and it lingers unresolved. Acknowledge it fully, and the narrative risks drifting further from the central claim of unlawful information gathering. There was no clean option. And that's when the story took another turn. Because this message wasn't just about Harry and Chelsy. It was about what was happening simultaneously elsewhere in his life. About the emotional bandwidth required to navigate two parallel realities, one public, one private, without collision. And collision, it seems, was inevitable. The courtroom didn't hear from Meghan. There was no statement from her side, no rebuttal, no framing. Silence in this context became its own presence. That absence mattered. Because without a counternarrative, The message existed alone, uncontextualized by anyone except the person who received it. And Chelsy's decision to simply present it without commentary made it harder to dismiss as misinterpretation. It wasn't presented as a plea or an invitation or a crisis. It was presented as a fact. And facts, once introduced, have a way of rearranging everything around them. The judge didn't linger on it. The court didn't sensationalize it, but the audience, both inside and outside the room, did what audiences always do when confronted with contradiction. They tried to reconcile it. How could someone speak of destiny while privately questioning direction? How could certainty coexist with longing? And perhaps most pointedly, what does it say about the narrative that has been repeated, defended, and monetized for years? Well, this is the moment where the trial's emotional center quietly shifted. It was no longer just about whether journalists behaved unlawfully. It was about whether the story Harry has told about the past is as complete as he believed. Incomplete stories aren't lies. They're selections. And selections, once exposed, invite scrutiny. That scrutiny became visible in Harry's demeanor. Reports described flashes of irritation, moments where he seemed to bristle at implications rather than accusations. A sensitivity not to what was being said, but to what was being inferred. Inference is powerful precisely because it can't be cross-examined. You can deny an allegation. You can dispute a fact. But you can't easily erase a question once it's lodged in the room. And the question now was unavoidable. If Harry was still looking backward emotionally so close to the wedding, what does that suggest about the certainty he later projected? And if that certainty was, in part, performative, shaped by pressure, expectation, or necessity, where does responsibility truly lie? These aren't questions the court is obligated to answer, but they are questions the audience will carry forward. Because the deeper this trial goes, the less it resembles a clean battle between right and wrong, victim and aggressor. Instead, it's becoming a study in timing, in emotional overlap, in what happens when personal history refuses to stay compartmentalized. And the most unsettling part, the message wasn't the end of it, because once timing entered the record, it opened the door to something else entirely. Harry's reaction in real time. Not years ago, not in text, but in that room, under oath, with witnesses watching closely. When does a private message stop being private? Not when it's written, not even when it's received. Sometimes it becomes public only when it collides with something bigger than the people involved. A legal process, a sworn statement, a question asked under oath that can't be answered without opening a door no one planned to walk through. That's what happened here, because the message didn't surface as gossip. It didn't arrive via leak or tabloid. It entered the room through procedure, slowly, carefully, almost reluctantly. And that alone stripped it of the usual defenses people rely on when uncomfortable truths emerge. There was no headline framing, no commentary, no sources say. Just a fact introduced into the record. And the moment that happened, the nature of the case changed. Up to then, the structure had been familiar. Harry describing a pattern, newspapers accused of unlawful tactics, the emotional damage those tactics allegedly caused, a through line, connecting intrusive reporting to broken trust and strained relationships. It's a compelling argument when the narrative runs cleanly forward. But the introduction of that message forced the story to bend backward. Suddenly, the court wasn't just evaluating what journalists did, it was inadvertently examining what Harry felt. And when he felt it, independent of press behavior. That distinction matters more than it seems, because courts are built to assess actions, not inner conflicts. And yet here was an inner conflict, preserved in writing, appearing in a forum that demands coherence. The defense didn't need to exploit it aggressively. They didn't need to frame it as betrayal or duplicity. All they needed to do was establish relevance, and relevance in this case was disturbingly easy to demonstrate. Harry has argued that press intrusion damaged his ability to maintain stable relationships. Chelsy's testimony, by contrast, suggested that uncertainty existed even in the absence of immediate intrusion. That uncertainty wasn't chaotic. It wasn't reactive. It was contemplative, and contemplation doesn't fit neatly into claims of external sabotage. This is where things became delicate. Because no one was accusing Harry of wrongdoing, no one was questioning his sincerity outright. But sincerity, when dissected, becomes complicated. Especially when past and present narratives don't align perfectly. The judge didn't interrupt. The court didn't sensationalize. But the room grew still, in that way it does when something unplanned takes hold. People sensed it. This wasn't supposed to be central, but it was becoming unavoidable. And Harry seemed to realize it too. Witnesses later described a subtle tightening. A shift in posture. The kind of physical response people have when they recognize that control is slipping, not because of an attack, but because of exposure. Exposure isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, waiting for the next question. And the next question wasn't even aggressive. It was procedural. Was the message contemporaneous? Yes. Was it preserved? Yes. What was it sent voluntarily? Yes. Each answer closed another escape route. Because once a message is established as contemporaneous and voluntary, it stops being anecdotal. It becomes evidence of state of mind, not definitive proof of anything, but suggestive. And suggestion is powerful when paired with timing. Harry's legal strategy had been built on clarity. Press intrusion equals harm. Remove the intrusion, and the harm becomes unjustifiable. But Chelsy's account introduced an alternate variable, one that doesn't negate intrusion, but complicates causality. What if harm wasn't linear? What if it wasn't solely imposed? What if some of it originated in conflict Harry carried internally, regardless of who was watching? Those are dangerous questions in a courtroom, because they blur responsibility. And blurred responsibility is a defense attorney's quiet ally. The prosecution had to tread carefully, push too hard on emotional nuance. And the trial risks drifting from its legal mandate, pull back too much, and the unaddressed implication festers. That tension played out in the pacing. Questions became shorter, transitions more deliberate. There was a noticeable effort to return to the core allegations. But the room didn't fully follow, because once a personal truth enters a public record, it has gravity. It pulls attention. It reframes everything around it. Harry's answers reflected that strain. He didn't contradict Chelsy. He didn't dispute the existence of the message. He contextualized. He explained. He emphasized pressure, confusion, the extraordinary circumstances of his life. All reasonable, all human, but explanation is not erasure. And every explanation seemed to underline the same uncomfortable reality. That certainty, at that moment in time, was not as absolute as later narratives suggested. That doesn't make those narratives false, but it makes them incomplete. And incompleteness is uncomfortable when you're under oath. What complicated matters further was the broader implication for the case itself, because if Harry's emotional turmoil can't be traced exclusively to press intrusion, the causal chain weakens. Again, not breaks. Weakens. That's enough to matter. The defense didn't pounce. They waited. Let the implications breathe. Let the audience, including the judge, sit with the contradiction without being told what to think. It was a calculated restraint, and restraint, in moments like this, often speaks louder than confrontation. Observers began to note a change not just in Harry's demeanor, but in how the court perceived the scope of the case. It was no longer a clean examination of journalistic ethics. It had become a window into how public narratives are constructed, defended, and sometimes contradicted by private record. That's a dangerous place for any public figure, especially one who has spent years insisting on the importance of truth, transparency, and accountability, because once transparency is invoked, it applies in all directions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A case brought to expose wrongdoing had inadvertently exposed something else entirely. The fragility of a story told with certainty. And this is where the atmosphere shifted from analytical to tense, because the more this line of questioning unfolded, the more visible Harry's discomfort became. Not explosive, not disrespectful, but unmistakable. Shorter answers, a sharper tone, a defensiveness that hadn't been present earlier, not toward Chelsy, toward the implications. It's one thing to confront an adversary. It's another to confront your own past choices in a forum where every word is recorded. And that confrontation was happening in real time. The court pressed on, but carefully. No one wanted to overreach. No one wanted to be seen as exploiting personal history. But by then, it didn't matter. The door was open. And behind it was something far more destabilizing than a text message. It was Harry's reaction, because as the questioning continued, frustration began to surface in ways that could not be attributed to legal pressure alone. And that frustration, according to those present, was about to cross a line that even the court could not ignore. What happened next wouldn't come from opposing counsel. It wouldn't come from Chelsy. It would come from Harry himself. And when it did, it would draw the attention of someone whose role is not to soothe emotions, but to enforce boundaries. What happens when the person bringing the case becomes the disruption? It's not a comfortable question, but once the message, the timing and the implications settled into the room, it was impossible to ignore, because the tension that followed didn't come from the bench. It didn't come from opposing counsel. It came from the witness box. From Harry. At first, it was subtle. The kind of shift that doesn't register on transcripts but is immediately obvious to anyone sitting a few meters away. Answers that had been expansive earlier became clipped. Explanations tightened. There was a sense of urgency creeping in, as if time itself had become an adversary. That's often what happens when someone feels their narrative slipping. This wasn't hostility. Not yet. It was something closer to impatience. With the questions, with the direction of the discussion, with the fact that the trial had drifted into territory he hadn't prepared for, because no matter how much you rehearse for court, you can't rehearse for implication. Implication arrives sideways. It doesn't accuse. It suggests. And it's far harder to defend against something that isn't being said directly. Observers describe a moment where Harry leaned forward slightly, voice sharpening, as if trying to steer the conversation back to what he believed mattered. Press intrusion. Illicit tactics. Long-term harm. All legitimate points. All central to the case. But the problem was that the court was no longer only listening for those points. It was listening for alignment, for coherence, for whether the emotional story matched the legal one. And the alignment wasn't holding. This is where frustration becomes dangerous in court, because frustration isn't evidence, but it is information. It tells the room that something has landed closer to the nerve than intended. Harry has spoken openly in the past about anger. His own, his family's, his mother's legacy of being consumed by the press. Anger, in his telling, is often framed as a response to injustice, a moral reaction. What appeared in court, however, looked different. This wasn't righteous anger, it was reactive, and reactivity, under oath, makes people nervous. The questions themselves remained measured. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation. But Harry's responses began to edge towards something else. A defensiveness that suggested the issue wasn't misunderstanding, but discomfort. Discomfort with where the conversation had gone. At one point, according to those present, Harry appeared to bristle at the implied relevance of his past relationship to the case at hand. The reaction wasn't verbalized as objection, but it didn't need to be. Body language did the work. A pause held too long. A breath taken sharply. A look that lingered on the questioner just a moment more than necessary. These are small things, but courtrooms are built to notice small things. Because small things often reveal what larger statements conceal. And then, something shifted. Not explosively, not theatrically, but decisively. Harry's tone reportedly crossed from strained into confrontational. Not in content. The words themselves were still defensible. But in delivery. A firmness that bordered on challenge. A sense that he was no longer simply answering questions, but pushing back against the premise of them. That's a line witnesses are warned about before they ever take the stand. Because the moment a witness appears to argue rather than respond, credibility becomes fragile. The room noticed. And so did someone else. This is where the presence of Princess Anne became significant. Not because she intervened dramatically, but because she didn't need to. Her role in moments like this isn't ceremonial. It's corrective. According to accounts, her warning was brief. Low. Unambiguous. The kind of intervention that doesn't escalate tension but instantly recalibrates it. No theatrics. No lecture. Just a reminder of where authority sits. And suddenly the room reset. Harry pulled back. The edge softened. The answers steadied, but the moment had already done its damage. Because once a warning is issued, especially by someone known for restraint, it signals that a boundary was approached, if not crossed. And that changes how everything that follows is interpreted. The irony was hard to miss. A case about unchecked power had just revealed a moment where power, Emotional, positional, or both, had to be checked. And it wasn't by the court alone. This wasn't about silencing Harry. It wasn't about undermining his claims. It was about maintaining the integrity of the process, about ensuring that emotion didn't overtake examination. But integrity cuts both ways. Because the fact that such an intervention was necessary raised a new question. One the court didn't ask, but the audience certainly did. If this subject provoked such a reaction, how deeply did it cut, and why? Harry regained composure. The proceedings continued. On paper, nothing dramatic happened. But courtrooms are not just about paper. They are about impression. And the impression left behind was unmistakable. This line of inquiry had touched something unresolved, something raw enough to disrupt the rhythm of a case that had otherwise been tightly controlled. This is where the trial stopped feeling like a legal argument and started feeling like an emotional audit. Because now the audience wasn't just weighing facts, they were weighing reactions, noticing what provoked attention and what didn't, observing which topics Harry navigated with ease and which seemed to destabilize him. Press intrusion? Confident. Historical reporting? Composed. Unlawful tactics? Controlled anger. But the intersection of past relationship, timing, and doubt, that was different. That was personal. And personal moments, once exposed, don't recede quietly, they ripple. The defense didn't capitalize overtly. They didn't need to. The court had seen enough to register that something fundamental had shifted. From this point forward, Harry was no longer just the aggrieved party seeking accountability. He was also a witness grappling with a version of himself that didn't fully align with the story he had prepared to tell. That's a difficult position for anyone. And it's about to become even more complicated, because while the warning in court reset the tone, it also drew attention to something else entirely, the collateral impact of that moment. Specifically, the people Harry referenced, directly or indirectly, as frustration spilled over, and one name in particular, would change how the next phase of this trial is understood. When frustration spills, who absorbs the impact? That's the question that settled into the room after the warning, once the temperature dropped just enough for people to notice what had actually happened. Because the reset didn't erase the moment, it reframed it. And in that reframing, attention drifted to the edges, to the names that hadn't been central, to the figures who hadn't spoken, but whose presence suddenly mattered. One of those names carried a particular weight. Catherine. She wasn't there to testify. She wasn't part of the legal dispute. And yet, in the wake of that strained exchange, her position became relevant in a way the court hadn't intended. Not because of anything she did, but because of what boundaries she represents inside the institution Harry has spent years criticizing. Royal families run on unspoken lines. Everyone inside them knows where they are, even if no one writes them down. You can challenge the press. You can challenge policy. You can even challenge the monarchy itself in certain ways. But there are names you don't pull into your orbit casually, especially in a courtroom where tone and restraint are currency. What observers picked up on wasn't a direct attack. It was subtler than that. A reference, a comparison, a moment where frustration, searching for an outlet, brushed against a figure who symbolizes continuity, discretion, and institutional survival. That's why it landed awkwardly. Because Catherine doesn't function in the public imagination as an individual actor in Harry's story. She functions as a boundary marker. She represents the line between personal grievance and institutional cohesion, and when that line is approached, even indirectly, the consequences ripple outward. The court didn't admonish Harry for the reference. It didn't need to. The reaction in the room did the work. A slight stiffening. A pause that lasted a beat too long. The kind of silence that communicates disapproval without saying a word. This wasn't about loyalty or sides. It was about scope. The case had already drifted dangerously close to becoming something it wasn't meant to be. A referendum on personal relationships within the royal family. Bringing Catherine into the emotional frame, even tangentially threatened to widen that scope beyond control. And that matters, because Harry's credibility in this trial isn't just legal, it's perceptual. He's asking the court to see him as a principled claimant, focused on accountability and reform. Moments like this complicate that image, not because they prove malice or intent, but because they suggest that personal grievances may be bleeding into places they don't belong. Again, this isn't about fault. It's about impression. Impression is what jurists, judges, and observers are left with when facts alone don't tell the whole story. And the impression forming now was uncomfortable. Because the frustration Harry displayed didn't appear to be about Catherine herself, it appeared to be about what she represents. A version of royal life that functioned without rupture, without public rebellion, without the kind of internal fracture Harry has described experiencing. That contrast has always been there, hovering quietly beneath the surface of royal narratives. But it rarely enters legal proceedings so nakedly. This is where irony sharpens. Harry's case rests on the claim that external forces damaged his relationships, that the press destabilized what could have been stable. Yet here, under scrutiny, we see tension not just with the press but with the very architecture of the institution he left behind. And Catherine, by virtue of her role, stands as a reminder of that architecture. The court didn't explore this. It couldn't. It wasn't relevant in a technical sense. But relevance isn't only legal, sometimes it's contextual. And context shapes interpretation. Observers began to question whether the emotional spillover they were witnessing was a byproduct of this specific testimony, or evidence of something more persistent, a long-standing frustration with how different members of the same family navigated the same pressures and emerged with different outcomes. That comparison is rarely fair. Lives diverge. Circumstances vary. Personalities clash. But fairness isn't the issue here. Visibility is. Because once a name like Catherine enters the orbit of a case like this, it reframes the story yet again. It suggests that the trial isn't just about Harry versus the press, it's about Harry versus a version of royal life he feels excluded from, or perhaps never fully believed in. That's a heavy emotional load to carry into a courtroom. And it complicates the audience's role. Viewers aren't just assessing whether journalists broke the law. They're watching a man negotiate unresolved comparisons in public. Comparisons he may not have consciously intended to surface, but which emerged anyway under pressure. This is where restraint becomes crucial. Harry pulled back after the warning. He corrected course. The immediate risk passed, but the residue remained. Because once frustration reveals its direction, it's hard to pretend it didn't. The court moved on. The questioning refocused. But the narrative had already expanded. And in that expansion, another absence became louder. Meghan. Not because she was mentioned, not because she needed to be defended, but because the dynamics unfolding, past relationships, institutional comparisons, emotional spillover, all orbit around the life Harry chose to build with her. Her silence in this moment is strategic, intentional, and revealing in its own way. Because silence, when everything else is exposed, becomes a statement. It allows the focus to remain on Harry, his words, his reactions, his unresolved tensions. It avoids inflaming a situation already straining at its edges. But it also leaves the narrative asymmetrical. Chelsy spoke. Harry reacted. Catherine's name surfaced as a boundary marker. Meghan remained offstage. That asymmetry matters because it shapes how responsibility is perceived. Who is seen as reactive? Who is seen as steady? Who appears to absorb pressure? And who appears to generate it? None of this is explicit. None of it is stated, but audiences are adept at reading subtext. And the subtext here is that the trial is no longer insulated from internal family dynamics. Those dynamics, once introduced, begin to color everything else. The legal claims remain. The allegations of unlawful conduct haven't evaporated, but they now exist alongside a more complicated emotional portrait. One that includes unresolved comparisons, institutional friction, and the consequences of letting personal history surface in the wrong room. The risk for Harry is not that he will lose on the merits, it's that the story he hoped to tell, clear, principled, focused, is becoming fragmented. Fragmentation doesn't require scandal, it requires drift. And drift is exactly what the court is trying to prevent. Which brings us to the next turn in this case. Because as the proceedings continued, the focus shifted again, this time away from personal names and toward structural consequences. What happens when a case designed to expose wrongdoing begins to expose something else instead? And how far can that drift go before it changes the outcome entirely? What does silence communicate when everyone is listening? That question grew louder as the proceedings moved on, precisely because nothing was said. No statement. No clarification. No attempt to balance the emotional weight that had entered the room, just absence. Deliberate, controlled, and impossible to ignore. Meghan Markle was not present. That fact alone isn't unusual. But in a trial increasingly shaped by personal history, her absence began to function as a kind of gravity. Everything else seemed to orbit around it. Chelsy spoke carefully and without flourish. Harry reacted visibly and in real time. Catherine's name hovered briefly, marking a line no one wanted crossed, and Meghan remained offstage. In many ways, that silence did exactly what it was supposed to do. It prevented escalation. It avoided adding another emotional vector to an already unstable situation. It kept the spotlight where the law says it belongs. On Harry. On the press. On the alleged misconduct. But silence has a way of filling space. Especially when the narrative around it grows louder, because the testimony wasn't just about a message sent years ago. It was about a moment of emotional overlap, a period when two futures existed simultaneously. One being constructed publicly, the other being acknowledged privately, and that overlap, once revealed, inevitably invites comparison. Not of character, of timing. The public narrative surrounding Harry and Meghan has always emphasized decisiveness. A sense that once they found each other there was no hesitation, no ambivalence. Just clarity sharpened by adversity. That story has been repeated so often it's hardened into fact. But the courtroom introduced friction. Not contradiction. Friction. Friction doesn't shatter a story. It rubs against it, wears at the edges, forces reassessment without declaring anyone wrong. And Meghan's silence allowed that friction to remain unresolved. Had she spoken, even briefly, the moment might have been contextualized, framed as pre-commitment anxiety, or dismissed as emotional noise before a major life decision. Any number of explanations could have softened the impact. But explanations also escalate. Silence de-escalates, at least on the surface. The problem is what happens underneath. Because without a counterweight, the testimony stood alone, not exaggerated, not rebutted, simply present. And that presence altered how the audience processed everything else. Harry's earlier frustration now looked different when viewed through this lens. Less like defensiveness toward the press, more like discomfort with a narrative slipping out of his control, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. This is where the trial edges into dangerous territory for any public figure. The gap between what was lived and what was later narrated. All narratives simplify. They have to. Lives don't. Meghan's role in Harry's life has been framed as transformative, a break from the past, a new chapter defined by choice rather than inheritance. That framing depends on contrast, the old life versus the new one. Chelsy's testimony blurred that contrast, not by challenging the depth of Harry's later commitment, but by reminding everyone that transitions are rarely clean. That certainty is often constructed over time, not discovered in a single moment, and that reminder landed at precisely the wrong moment. Because Harry's case relies on a clean through line. The press caused harm. That harm necessitated radical change. And that change led to a healthier, more authentic life. That through line becomes harder to defend when the past reappears not as damage inflicted, but as doubt expressed. Again, this doesn't absolve the press. It complicates causality. And causality is the backbone of legal claims. Meghan's absence allowed the court to focus on that complication without distraction. But it also allowed audiences to project meaning into the silence. Projection is inevitable when information is asymmetrical. Some will see restraint. Others will see distance. Still others will interpret it as strategic insulation, allowing Harry to absorb the blow while keeping the broader narrative intact. None of these interpretations are provable. But all of them will circulate. And circulation is influence. This is the paradox of silence in high-profile cases. It preserves legal discipline while surrendering narrative control. You avoid missteps, but you also relinquish the chance to frame meaning. Harry, in contrast, did not relinquish control easily. His reactions earlier suggest someone acutely aware of narrative stakes. Someone who understands that this trial isn't just about winning a legal argument. It's about preserving coherence between the story he's told about his past and the life he's built since. Meghan's silence places that burden squarely on him. And burden changes behavior. Observers noted that after the moment involving Chelsy's testimony and the subsequent warning, Harry became more guarded, less expansive. Answers were technically sufficient, but emotionally narrower. As if you were choosing each word not just for accuracy, but for containment. Containment is what you do when you're trying to stop a spill. The problem is that once something has spilled, once doubt has entered the record, containment can look like avoidance. And avoidance invites inference. The defense didn't need to exploit this, the situation was doing their work for them. By simply returning to the technical aspects of the case, they allowed the contrast to linger. Harry animated and reactive when discussing personal history, controlled and composed when discussing journalistic conduct. That contrast doesn't undermine his claims, but it reshapes how those claims are perceived. It suggests layers, and layered narratives are harder to adjudicate. The absence of Meghan's voice also raises a quieter, more uncomfortable question. Whose story is this really? Is it Harry's alone? Is it shared? Or is it a composite narrative that only works when everyone involved plays their part in synchrony? Courtrooms disrupt synchrony. They force moments out of sequence. They pull threads that were never meant to be tugged individually. And they do it under conditions where silence can be as consequential as speech. As the day wore on, it became clear that the trial was no longer just testing journalistic ethics. It was testing the resilience of a carefully maintained personal narrative under forensic attention. Meghan's silence preserved her position. It avoided making her a subject rather than a symbol. But it also left Harry exposed, alone in the witness box, navigating not just legal questions but emotional residue. And that exposure has consequences, because the more the trial proceeds, the more it risks answering a different question than the one it was designed to address. Not did the press act unlawfully, but how much of this story has been simplified to survive public scrutiny? That's not a question courts like to answer. But it's a question audiences will carry forward, regardless of the verdict. And the next phase of this case will make that tension impossible to ignore. Because the focus is about to shift again, away from personal dynamics, away from silence and reaction, and toward the structural integrity of the case itself. What happens when a legal argument begins to bend under the weight of unintended revelations? And can it be pulled back into frame before something essential is lost? What if the strongest evidence in this case isn't about phone hacking at all? That question crept in quietly as the proceedings moved forward, almost unnoticed at first. Because by now, the trial had accumulated something courts are never entirely comfortable with: excess meaning, too many threads, too many interpretations, too much emotional context pressing in on what was meant to be a narrowly defined legal argument. And this is where cases begin to drift, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally as each new detail subtly reframes what came before. The court tried to correct course. Questions returned to process, to method, to specifics, dates, publications, alleged tactics, the mechanics of information gathering, the legal architecture that underpins claims of unlawful behavior. This was, after all, supposed to be about what newspapers did, not what Harry felt. And yet, feeling had already entered the record. Not as speculation, not as interpretation. As evidence of state of mind. Once that happens, it doesn't leave simply because the court wishes it to. Harry's central claim is straightforward in structure, if complex in proof. He argues that journalists working for associated newspapers engaged in unlawful information gathering, phone hacking, blagging, surveillance, and that this conduct caused real harm to his personal life, particularly his relationships. The publisher's position is equally clear. They deny the allegations outright. They assert that their reporting was based on legitimate sources, responsible journalism, and information that was either already public or lawfully obtained. They emphasize the age of many of the stories in question, arguing that complaints raised decades later are opportunistic rather than evidentiary. Both sides are, in legal terms, playing familiar roles. But what disrupted that balance was not a technical inconsistency. It was narrative interference. Because once Chelsy's testimony and Harry's reactions entered the frame, the court was no longer dealing solely with causation in a linear sense. It was confronted with overlapping explanations for the same emotional outcomes. And overlapping explanations weaken certainty. The legal system thrives on clarity, on isolating variables, on drawing lines between action and consequence. What this trial began to reveal instead was a convergence of forces. Press intrusion, institutional pressure, personal doubt, all operating simultaneously. That convergence doesn't negate wrongdoing, but it makes it harder to prove that wrongdoing was decisive. This is where the defense gains quiet ground. They don't have to disprove harm. They only have to introduce reasonable doubt about its source. And doubt, by now, was plentiful. Harry's testimony continued. He spoke about feeling hunted, about losing trust, about how constant surveillance distorted his sense of safety. None of that rang false. None of it was contradicted directly. But the court now had an additional lens through which to view those claims. Was every fracture the result of press behavior? Or were some fractures internal, emerging from conflict Harry carried regardless of who was watching? The defense didn't push this aggressively. They didn't need to. The groundwork had already been laid by the very witness the court hadn't expected to hear from. That's the danger of unintended relevance. Once introduced, it doesn't stay contained. Observers noted that as questioning turned back to technical matters, Harry seemed more composed. The earlier edge dulled. His answers became methodical, precise, almost rehearsed. This wasn't a criticism. It was a contrast. And contrasts invite interpretation. Why did composure return when the focus shifted away from personal history? Why did agitation spike when timing and doubt entered the discussion? Again, these aren't questions the court will rule on, but they're questions that shape perception. And perception, especially in high-profile cases, has consequences far beyond the verdict. This trial is being watched not just by lawyers, but by the public, by commentators, by institutions that care deeply about precedent. And what they're seeing is a case that, while legally coherent, is emotionally overdetermined. Too many meanings, too many narratives intersecting. That's rarely a position of strength. Harry's broader campaign against the press has always been framed as principled, a fight not just for himself, but for systemic change, for accountability, for reform. This case was meant to be a cornerstone of that effort. Instead, it's becoming something else. A case study in how personal narrative, once exposed to forensic scrutiny, can complicate even the most carefully constructed legal argument. The judge, for their part, remained disciplined. There was no indulgence of tangents, no overt commentary on emotional testimony. The court pressed forward, aware of its mandate. But discipline doesn't erase residue. The residue here is a lingering question about focus. Is this trial still about press ethics? Or has it become an examination of how public figures process, and later reinterpret, their own pasts? That question matters because it affects how the outcome will be read. If Harry prevails, some will credit the strength of his evidence. Others will argue that the case succeeded despite narrative complications. If he doesn't, the loss may be attributed not to weak claims, but to drift, to a failure to keep the story clean. Either way, the narrative impact will extend beyond the courtroom. Because this case has already done something unusual. It has peeled back the layers of a story the public thought it understood. It has revealed uncertainty where certainty was assumed. It has shown how timing, once questioned, can destabilize even the most confident retelling. And that destabilization is now part of the record. As proceedings continued, the focus narrowed further. The court examined specific articles, specific sources, specific claims. It was, on the surface, a return to normalcy, but the atmosphere never fully recovered. There was a sense, subtle but present, that something essential had already been revealed, regardless of how the legal arguments concluded. Harry sat in the witness box not just as a claimant, but as a person.